Okay, so this is going to be a series of videos on the NN19 sampler and talking about sampling in general. We've spent quite a lot of time learning how to use the subtractor, learning about subtractive synthesis, and comparing how a subtractive synthesizer works in relation to acoustic instruments. Eventually, you should have come to the conclusion, hopefully, that when you're actually trying to create sounds on a subtractive synthesizer, you can only go so far. But as computers developed and started to get more powerful, the ability to sample instruments became much more a reality. And samplers were obviously independent boxes when they first started out, actually hardware samplers. But now inside Reason and Logic and pretty much every other program that you use, you will find some sort of sampling unit. Samplers basically convert the analog signal into digital, so into binary, and then they convert that back out into an analog signal. So that's called analog to digital conversion and digital to analog conversion. When you can do that, you can actually record the actual sounds of instruments, audio sounds of instruments, and put them into a sampler, which is going to give you a much better representation of how that instrument sounds than being able to program it in a subtractive synthesizer. To give you an example here, I've already got a clarinet in here. Which has much more of the qualities of the acoustic instrument than if you tried to program that in the subtractor. Okay, let's have a look at the NN19 then. The first thing I'm going to do is just initialize it. And one thing you will notice about if you initialize the NN19 is that there's no sound in there. It basically strips it of any samples. And the first thing that you're probably going to want to look at if you're using an NN19 before you actually start putting your own samples into is the patch bank. If you go into the patch bank, you'll see there's lots of different instruments. Let's go to a flute sample, for instance. Have a listen to that. Okay, again, much more characteristic of the actual instrument sound because it's a sample rather than a synthesized emulation of that instrument. Okay, let's have a quick whiz around here. The other reason I put the subtractor up here is because what I wanted to show you is that so many of the controls that are on the NN19 are also on the subtractor. This is throughout Reason, but it's not only throughout Reason, and this is the reason why it was so important to learn how to use the subtractor and all the controls that are on there, because when you start to look at all the other devices, you find that there are so many similar controls. And even when you get out of Reason, you start looking at Logic. If you go in and look at the synths, you'll start to recognize a lot of the things like oscillators, filters, amps, ADSRs, velocity controls, and so forth. And what this means that you can now do is you can go and look at another device like this, and you can see straight away, hopefully, that there are a lot of similarities. They might not be exactly the same, but they do the same thing. And knowing how to recognize that is really useful. The first thing is, if you look at our oscillator bank here, there is only effectively one oscillator bank, although you can load multiple samples into it. So this appears here, okay, on this section. Now, on our subtractor, you've got octave, semitones, and cents. Well, the same thing happens here on the NN19. You also have a semitone control, okay, which is the same as this, and you have a fine tune, which is just the same as your sense control on your subtractor. So these three controls are identical, they just look a little bit different on here. There's some other stuff over here which we'll look at in a bit, okay, which are different. The amp envelope, well, there's your amp envelope here, there's your amp envelope on your NN19. Level, there's your overall level, there's your overall level on the subtractor. Okay, you come over to the filter section. Now, here on the subtractor, you've got filter and you've got the envelope as a separate kind of box. On the NN19, you've got your filter here with all exactly the same filter settings, so notch, high pass, band pass, low pass, 12 and 24, keyboard tracking control, resonance control, and a frequency control. It works in exactly the same way as it does on the subtractor. Okay, and underneath you have the filter envelope, which can take over control of your filter, okay, using an ADSR envelope. You also have an invert button. Now it looks a little bit different, but that's the invert button on the subtractor, that's the invert button on the NN19. Coming over to the LFO, again, if you look at the LFO, you'll notice some similar controls. Sync, which means it syncs to the tempo down here of the track, and then you can control note divisions, like setting it to 12 quarter notes or 16 quarter notes or 8th notes or 16th notes, so it actually beats at those divisions. You've got an amount control, exactly the same as you have on the subtractor. The same waveforms, triangle, sawtooth or ramp, square wave, and 2 random waves. And then slightly different, you haven't got so many destinations. That's because the NN19 hasn't got so many destinations for you to send things to. You can use oscillator, so you can send it to oscillator pitch, you can send it to filter, and you can also send it to pan, which is quite a nice one. It pans it from speaker to speaker like an auto pan kind of effect. Come over to the mod wheel. Again, pretty much the same controls here as you've got here. It's just this one's vertical and this one's horizontal. So filter frequency, resonance, decay, amp, and LFO. We haven't got any phase or FM on here, so there's obviously no way of sending it to phase or FM because there aren't any controls for that. The same goes for velocity. We've got less velocity controls, but some of the same ones. Filter envelope, filter decay, filter amp amount, attack, envelope attack, and we've also got a different one which is start time, which again I'll talk about in a minute. Okay, so when you come up here, you've got portamento, which is sliding between the notes, as we know again from the subtractor. We've got legato and retrig. Legato means smooth, and retrig means that it retriggers this envelope each time, so you get a harder attack on the note. You've got a pitch range for your controls here. You can go up to 2 octaves, 24 semitones. And a lot of the things really are very similar. Okay, so that's the first video, and we're going to look at some more things about the differences really in the next one.